Hello, everybody, and happy almost Thanksgiving. This will be my second Thanksgiving. I consider May been our first Thanksgiving, but any holiday or occasion that encourages gathering, gratitude, and spending time with the people that we care about with good food is a most welcome celebration in my book. So, this month and next month, we are going to be diving into the Banned from the Bible series. I'm going to be giving you some historical reference points. This time of the year, I do deal a lot with my Christian pantheon pagans that come to me for assistance with spells that often involve the Psalms or Proverbs. And there is a lot to Christian magic. Christianity back in the fourth century was very polytheistic. Obviously, now it's monotheistic. A lot has changed over the years, even amongst the different sects of Christianity. So, Baptists, Methodists, Lutheran, Zionist, Nazarene, Catholics, Trinity Catholics, you will notice that some of them include certain gospel and some of them exclude certain gospel. They also interpret things differently. Baptists love to gamble, it's totally fine and righteous. Whereas, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Baptists actually are the ones that say, no, no, that's gambling straight to hell. Whereas Catholics, for example, I love their casino nights, their bingo nights. Um, other things that, I mean, there's so many variables. It would literally take me weeks to kind of break through them all, but each sect has their own interpretive guide when it comes to the Old Testament and New Testament. And in reality, what I would like to do is present to you the origins, the sacred texts, the people behind the scenes who politicized parts of the Bible and manipulated different sacred texts to fit an agenda. And I think it's up to each and every one of us to find God on our own terms. I do believe in the creator, God, the divine source, but of course, as human beings, it's hard to identify and connect to like a blob of energy, which is what I believe God is, a divine blob of energy, with lots of offshoots that we call saints or orishas, depending on your practice. Um, it's if you give it a story and a name, it's easier to connect. And I think in every major religion, not just Christianity, we see very similar stories, very similar backgrounds, very similar saints and deities. And as an omnis polytheistic, I believe it all interconnects. I think, again, as I've talked in previous sessions, that, Saint Michael, Kali Ma, Kali in the Ars Goetia, the red and black terras in Buddhism. I think they're all the same entity, the same energy, but they present differently to us depending on what our beliefs are, where we are in the world, how we've been conditioned, how we've been raised. So I know this is very heady. And so I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm not going to get into the omnistic aspects of it. I just want to present to you the history of sacred texts connected to the Bible and what has been omitted and kind of why, and give you some ideas on how it's up to each and every one of us to understand God in a way that is authentic and not conditioned or kind of implanted to fit an agenda, perhaps by, political leaders that masquerade as religious leaders. So again, there's as with everything in the world, there's always kind of a dark side to things. And not that banned from the Bible is a dark side, but I'm giving you an alternate view, something to think about, something to research. So it is the holiday season. So I thought, what better time to do this presentation than in November and December, right? So let's jump into it. And I'm going to try not to be too draggy today. I know a lot of you are preparing for Thanksgiving next week. And probably getting things prepped and whatnot today in your kitchens. So I will try to not drag this out too much for you. Oh my goodness. I'm just trying to make my screen a little bit bigger here, you guys. Bear with me. I am not techie. Oh my gosh. All right, hang on. This is kind of ridiculous. I'll tell you, this is that Mercury retrograde in motion. Seriously. I have been having so many tech issues, from two different phone chargers failing on me to just kind of weird one-offs, Mercury retrograde. All right, you guys. All right, so banned from the Bible. This is part one of two. Today is going to be a lot of history. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, some food for thought in terms of where things came from and who kind of meddled with what. Oh, now I lost my there it is. Okay. All right. So, some of these terms I bite my tongue over. So you'll notice that, like in my other series, I'll use pseudonyms or shorthand verbiage to say some of these big crazy words. So Deuteronomy is the first from the King James version of the Bible. There are lots of Bible versions. We'll get into that later, but there shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. So, one of the warning passages in the King James version of the Bible, I do want to point out that one of the authorships of the New Testament, which is King James, is King David, who did have paranoid delusions that witches were chasing him, haunting him, hunting him. And if you do your research online, you will find that to be true. And I believe that is why this made it into the King James Version. So, the original King James Version had 73 books and included the Catholic books of the Old Testament that most Protestants label the Apocrypha. Those books were excluded from the King James Version in the United States after 1800 because of strong anti-Catholic bias. And again, King Solomon was involved in the King James Version, the New Testament, and there are reasons for that. He was an occultist. There's a lot of political stuff behind the scenes that goes on, which is why it's more political. When it says anti-Catholic, it's more like anti-Catholic agenda. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so God, I feel, is an incredibly poorly defined and misunderstood concept to begin with. Divine source, the creator, creation, again, like a blob of astrophysical energy that we can't really even begin to understand, right? With many different names, Yahweh, Odin, Zeus. There's so many names that this, Tetragrammaton, Allah, Shiva. I mean, there's so many names, but um, pagan also is a term that I think is really misunderstood. In when people hear the word pagan, they simply think that means not something that's not Judeo-Christian, which isn't necessarily true. I consider myself pagan and I'm not mystic, and I do incorporate Judeo-Christian practice in my practice, along with many other practices and methodologies in Buddhism and Hinduism, in Jain, Shinto, like lots of different incorporations. So there are many different words referring to divinity in Hebrew scriptures. Christianity largely doesn't acknowledge that. Um, when we start talking about the terms that are used to reference God, Adonai, Tetragrammaton, Tetragrammaton, you'll hear me say, Elohim. These terms mean all and none, right? We try to look for terms that kind of are omnipotent or have omnipotence attachments. And so it's kind of a meaningless concept, I think, in the first place to try to label this. But they refer to Adonai or Elohim. One could say that at the same time, the Goetic demons are gods, right? From the same Abrahamic pantheon. Because those words just refer to powers and dominions and not necessarily the most high, one true, ultimate, whatever. But people who talk about pagan gods are generally Christians who have only ever read the King James Bible and precious little even of that. And so they rarely have a clear definition of what these things even mean. And I say that as somebody who was raised in and out of multiple church environments where the rules were different in each one and interpretations were different, in a Pentecostal church, I was told if I refused the Holy Spirit, I was condemned to hell because it would never return. In a Baptist environment, I was told I cannot gamble, no playing cards, no casinos, but yet out the back door, my great grandma was loading eggplants and tomatoes and oranges for fertility and for job spells for people. It's very, very conflicting. Later on in life, I got married. My second ex-husband was Roman Catholic. Well, both my husbands were Roman Catholic, but my second one actually went through all the rituals, which Roman Catholicism, especially Trinity, is very ritualized, very pagan, in terms of what I've seen. But where we were expected to donate a certain amount of money every year and, donate our time at, spaghetti dinners and bingo fundraisers by volunteering, but yet we would not be acknowledged as members because we both had previously been divorced. Um, you know, in every environment, there's different interpretations, different rules, and they use different scripture in the Bible to justify these things. And it all comes down to who's in charge. It all comes down to the boss in that environment. Anyway, I feel like a lot of people, they just listen and they take what they hear for granted and they don't do their own research. And God gave us the tools to find him. And we need to be responsible and accountable as individuals to connect to God, divine source, creator, to understand it fully. If we're just going to church every Sunday and listening to whatever they're telling us and reading, whatever passage they're talking about that day, reading along and not really investigating and researching ourselves, we're really kind of, it's the blind leading the blind, right? So, or the corrupt leading the blind, which is even worse. So Christianity, Islam, and Judaism have done a lot of work to make it seem like they are not directly related to pagan religions. They've done this because by appearing special, unique, and separate from everything else, it justifies their war against everything else. And that's really every religion. Okay. There's very few outside of Buddhism that, doesn't have this kind of smudge. But in reality, they don't worship God, they worship a God. A God. This is very important. It's a very important sentence. In reality, they don't worship God, divine source, creator. They worship a God from an Abrahamic pantheon. So there's a book out there by Robert Turcan. It's called The Gods of Ancient Rome, Religion and Everyday Life from Archaic to Imperial Times. I do encourage you to read that book if you have an opportunity. It really kind of breaks this down in bite-sized pieces, but there's a lot there. I'm just going over some highlights today. Okay, so the Roman religion practices were in a process of transformation when the Christians arrived on the scene. Important to understand. It's one of the last remnant developments in religious practices that arose from cultural shifts happening all over the Greco-Roman world, starting with the founding of Alexandria and ending in the late 14th or 4th century, so 2nd to 4th century. This was a cosmopolitan kind of movement towards synchronization, which was underfoot across all traditions at that time. So this is the beginning of Christianity, okay, during this kind of period of upheaval and change. So in this time period, we see the development of emergent new practices, beliefs, and practices from across the Mediterranean and beyond. So you're fusing, Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt. All of this is kind of mushing together at this time. So no one was prohibiting other people's gods. On the contrary, they were trying to find what they had in common and how they might transcend, language itself. So, people were coming together saying, wow, your God sounds like my God. Maybe what do you do for offerings? This is what I do for offerings. And oh, okay, maybe we can kind of hodgepodge this and, hit both nails on the head just in case. People were working together. They were very polytheistic. They were starting to fuse and they were starting to see the similarities in their different practices with these different gods. They were saying, wow, it seems like the same, but we're calling him a different name and he looks different in the pictures. But maybe there's something to that. So in the now Greek controlled Egypt at that time, you see the rise of Hermeticism. Okay, that's a religious movement combining Greek philosophy with Egyptian alchemy and ritual, where Hermes and thought melded to become Hermes Trismegistos. Okay, so in Abrahamic tradition, we see the rise of apocalyptic literature that started getting big, end times, revelations, right? Which brings in aspects of pagan mythology into a Jewish cosmos. That's important to understand. So there's also an interjection at that time of Platonic philosophy through Jewish writers like Philo at the time. So Gnosticism, with varied expressions between Abrahamic, Egyptian, Christian, and the extant Median faith bends begin to appear. So again, mushing, right? Exploring all those Egyptian style afterlives, the afterlife stories and beliefs and myths through this Chaldean Pythagorean cosmology. I know these are a lot of big words, but the reason I'm breaking this down historically is so you can do your own research, of course. Don't ever just take somebody else's word for it. We all need to be accountable for learning. But this is the birth grounds, the birthing of Christianity, where, the main players came onto the scene to, take these sacred texts and start creating this, Christian movement. Okay. So you also see the proliferation of mystery cults at this time, though they had existed already in Eleusis, Samothrace, sorry, and around the Greek world for centuries, right? There were always these cults. In Roman times, they began to really multiply, becoming even more exotic as the empire expanded. So Mithras, Isis, Lovi Deliceno, Sabazios, and many other deities were imported, right? They were brought in from, Syria, wherever, and they begin to transform. They start to change into kind of the Roman Greco influence. So the Romans were influenced by ancient Near Eastern cultures from Egypt, the Levant, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Again, I studied archaeology and mythology for years, and this is very heady. But the reason, again, I'm breaking this down for you is so you can do your research, because this is the fusion era, right? This is where everything is kind of fusing, and we're starting to see, these deity interpools. So, like, for example, I'm omnistic polytheistic, so I believe that the deity that we refer to as Saint Michael is also Kali Ma in Hinduism, is the red Tara in Buddhism, is Kali in the Ars Goetia, which is Abrahamic pantheon deity. Santa Mirta's in there. I even think San Simonism is a little bit in there, San Simon. So I know those are different representations to different religions and spiritual belief groups, but for me, it's the same entity. It's the same energy. It just has different names, different faces, depending on what you believe in, but it's just one. It's all in one. So this is what was happening at that time. We were seeing this fusion, or not so much fusion, because these are real deities, but more or less an acknowledgement or an awareness or realization that when I am praying to Saint Uriel, I may also be praying to Osmodius. I may also be praying to Metatron, because it is the same energy, just different names, different presentations, different faces. All right, moving on. So in archaeological, historical, mythological studies, we've excavated all these magical amulets and engravings from this period where all these different deities are invoked in the same lines, right? Fusion. So you're seeing a mix of Osiris with Set, the nymphs, the muses, Jesus Christ, Yahweh, I mean, in a way that is perplexing to modern notions of these traditions, right? Because religion has been politicized, it has been weaponized over the years to keep people divided. So, this notion that Jesus Christ is in the same boat with the muses, the nymphs, Set, and Osiris, and that they're the same energy, just different faces, that's inconceivable, right? It's inconceivable because we have been conditioned to have that separatism. Anyways, moving on. I told you I'm going to try to keep it short today. So even in Christian literature, there are appearances from Artemis Ephesia, Aphrodite Urania, Thanatos, Roma, and other mythological motifs that don't have a clear Abrahamic counterpart because they're fused, right? They were acknowledging, well, wait a minute, Artemis and Ephesia are the same deity. We're calling them two different names. We're giving two different offerings, but really it's just one energy. It's one being. So let's combine them. Moving on. If you look carefully and deeply enough, you will see many signs of the Greek Roman gods and goddesses in the Christian singular God. All the roots are there. So I don't care if you're Norse worshiping Odin, if you are a Hellenistic Romo, if you're Hellenistic, worshiping Zeus as the god, the head honcho god. Like I said, if it's Allah, if it's Yahweh, it to me, it's all the same. I may call them different names depending on the work I'm doing, but it's the same energy. It's the same being. It's the same entity, right? All the roots are there in Christian, texts that the singular God, Tetragrammaton, Adonai, Yahweh, is indeed a reflection also of Odin, Zeus, and about a zillion other gods from, the second century till now and forever, right? Probably long before that too. There's only so many sacred texts that have been recovered over the years, right? Who knows what hasn't been recovered, who or that's was destroyed before people could learn about it. All right. So when Christianity spread and began to dominate pagan religions, Christians named saints, this is true, after important deities in those regions to make converting those people easier. Okay, so that's why you see Saint Apollos. That was specifically to convert the Apollo worshippers. Saint Denis, that was specifically to convert the Dionysus worshippers. Saint Demetrius, for Demeter. Saint Bridget, for Bridget. Okay, so correlations. Isn't it curious how these saints came to be, and how they were just closely connected and tied to these pre-existing Hellenistic deity? I mean, you really have to ask yourself, doesn't it seem weird? So the theory that God, specifically the Abrahamic God Yahweh, and demons originate from the same pantheon. It's not a mainstream like religious doctrine, but it is a concept in certain interpretations, especially in the Gnostic texts and academics, academic theories regarding the origins of early Israelite religion, that they all come from the same pantheon. He just was really good at, Yahweh was really good at, getting a smear campaign against the other ones. So, in Gnosticism, there's the Demiurge theory, right? That some early Gnostic Christian texts claim that Yahweh, the creator God of the Old Testament, was a lesser false creator God, I can't say this word, a demiurge, we'll say. Okay, I can't pronounce it right. He was jealous and he was mistaken for the true, unknowable, most high God. Unknowable, most high God. In this view, this demiurge and other spiritual entities might be seen as part of a shared, though flawed, cosmic structure, distinct from the ultimate divine source. I kind of feel that. I feel like this divine source, the creator, he has lots of spouts and sprouts, right? And we call them different things, give them different names. They kind of are the middlemen, but he's kind of this unattainable, he, she ball of energy. I don't know what you want to call it, right? So it makes sense to me. I think cosmic structure can be funny. We don't really fully understand it, but I kind of dig that. So Canaanite pantheons. So in the Canaanite pantheon, we see the term Elohim. Okay. So academic and historical analysis suggests that the early Israelite understanding of God, they used the term Elohim. Now that's a plural form term, meaning many gods. Okay. But that it evolved over time. So in the context of ancient Canaanite religion, again, this is all part of the Bible, you guys, what created the Bible in the first place. There was a pantheon of gods, okay? Yahweh's early followers were initially polytheistic. They were henotheistic, worshiping one God while acknowledging the existence of others. So it's important to remember that in the beginning, things were very different. They don't look like they do today, Okay, so I mean, again, it's our responsibility to learn these things because they don't teach us this in Sunday school. They teach what they've been told to teach by their leaders through their own unique interpretations, which is attached to their personal agendas. So rivalry and jealousy is quite fluid in the Bible, both New and Old Testament. So the jealous God passages in the Bible, things like "You shall have no other gods before me" in Exodus, can be interpreted in this historical context as a demand for exclusive worship amidst a polytheistic environment, because it was very polytheistic back then. So where other deities like Baal, part of the Ars Goetia, were considered rivals for the people's attention, right? So eventually this monotheistic stance came in, and it involved redefining these other Elohim as non-existent or as lesser demonic spirits. Okay, so how did they do that? So the theory that the demons of the Ars Goetia were the subject of a smear campaign, and I'm calling them demons even though they are Elohim. Okay, it's kind of a modern alternative interpretation. It comes from demonology, it comes from demonolatry and New Age esotericism. It's true, but these people are doing their research. They're not just pulling shit out of their ass. Well, not all of them, at least. So the entities listed in grimoires, like the Lesser Key of Solomon, specifically its very first section, the Ars Goetia, these were not inherently evil demons. They weren't called demons in their original conception. Originally, demon meant neutral spirit, by the way. The word demon has been demonized over the years. So the pagan origins, many of these entities were originally a part of a very big pre-Abrahamic pagan pantheon of gods, Elohim, where Yahweh comes from, where they were revered as minor gods, spirits, or very powerful natural forces, right? Along with Yahweh. Then there was the Christian demonization, right? So with the rise and spread of Christianity, these pagan deities were systematically reclassified and defamed as malevolent demons or fallen angels in an effort to erase rival belief systems and consolidate Christian influence. So when we talk about misrepresentation, I always encourage people. I did a reading list a month or two ago there's a lot of 12th to 14th century grimoires on there. Very good information. But the grimoires written from a Christian perspective, they really present biased descriptions of these entities, especially Solomon's perspective. They really focus on their negative aspects, or they kind of frame their unique knowledges and powers as dangerous or temptations that lead us astray. But all entities have good and bad, light and dark um, aspects, right? One that can curse can also cure. There's always yin and yang with everything that exists, including deity. You guys, they're no different. That yin and yang is in everything. I've been talking a lot today, so I don't want to lose my voice. All right, this perspective differs from the traditional Christian view, which holds that these entities are genuinely fallen angels who rebelled against God. Now, this can be argued. I'm not going to do it today. That's a make-believe story, the whole fallen angel make-believe story situation. We're not going to do that today. Today, I'm going to stick to just historical reference points. Okay, so modern interpretations, especially within certain occult practices and communities, often view the goetic spirits in a much more neutral or nuanced light. So some occultists, following figures like Aleister Crowley, view the process of working with goetic entities as a form of psychological self-exploration or a way to access archetypal energies within the human psyche. So basically what it's saying is that this pantheon of gods, this pre-Abrahamic pantheon, all of the goetics were there, including Yahweh. But Yahweh did a very good smear campaign along with the Catholic Church and, was the victor here. So practitioners in some modern traditions approach these entities as non-violent. They are powerful spirits who can be worked with for knowledge, for personal development, or, specific practical aids, provided there's a very respectful contractual relationship established. Now, In Christian and many other theological perspectives, the relationship with God is generally described in terms of a covenant, which, fundamentally they say is different from what they call exploitative and power-based blood contracts with, again, quote unquote, demons in folklore and some occult beliefs. I don't see it that way. My interpretation from what I have studied is you have a blood contract with Yahweh too through consuming Christ's blood, right? So when you take communion and you eat that little paper wafer and you drink that little grape juice drink, that is a blood contract, right? So there's contracts on both sides. Whatever deities you're working with, I don't necessarily think you have to have a contract. There's usually offerings and things like that involved, but I think this is a very troubling, like confusing area because Yahweh definitely demands a contract of obedience to him and him alone, or you suffer. And you do need to take the body and blood of Christ, which is contractual. So, anyways, moving on. Sorry. I don't, like I said, I didn't want to do too much of that today. I wanted to do more like, here's the information to research with. So a covenant with God, such as the old covenant with Israel, it was sealed with animal sacrifices. And then in the new covenant, there was Jesus, and it was sealed through Jesus's blood. So this is considered a sacred relational promise initiated by God, intended for our salvation, blessing, and restoration. So relational, but not transactional, right? So covenants are supposed to be based on grace, promise, and mutual commitment. It should not be a performance-based exchange of goods or services like you would find in a contract, which in today's day and age, it has become transactional through. I mean, I remember when our girls were going to St. Rita's, we had to fill out paperwork and provide tax returns so they could basically figure out how much our 10% was that we were supposed to be giving each year. That's a transaction, not me putting whatever I have free for the week in the offering bowl, but you're expecting a specific dollar amount. That's a transaction. For protection in life, the blood involved in biblical covenants. First there were animals, and then when Christ came into the picture, there was Christ. But this is a sign of life giving substitutionally to cover sin and protect people from destruction. So you find this in a lot of different practices still. Loaded organ puppetry practice, for example. So there is still that sacrifice element when working with deity. So, I mean, that seems to fit the pagan process, right? So, in contrast, the idea of a blood contract or quote unquote deal with the devil is, I really think this is popularized by movies, okay? This exploitative kind of transactional agreement where somebody trades their soul for, worldly gain like wealth or, power. That's movie stuff. That's not real world practice goetic work. I mean, sure, we may work with goetic to try to attract abundance or prosperity or to have knowledge to do so, but it's, this movie, the Hollywood really kind of ran with that. They really helped, foster some of this, but quote unquote demons, or they should be called the goetic, are believed to use these contracts to manipulate and destroy people. And the terms are often broken or twisted to harm people involved. Again, make believe movie stuff. These pacts are made for selfish gain and lead to spiritual bondage sometimes, but that's with any deity. Okay, that's not just goetics. That can result in eternal damnation. I wouldn't say there's such a thing as eternal damnation. It may result in your judgment not going well and you not having a lot of options, where maybe you have to come back and you have to pay your karmic debt, or do a do-over before you can move on to the next phase of your soul work. But that's just my belief. But that's according to just traditional Christian beliefs is how it works. All right. So no single version of the Bible has been completely banned. But here's the thing, many books have been excluded from certain canons for different theological, historical, and authorship reasons. I'm going to go over a lot of the examples today, not all of them, but some of the big ones. Um, but even, even now you'll see that Baptists will include the book of John, but Catholics won't. For example, they don't acknowledge the book of John, whereas this other group does. So I'm just using that as a wild example that different subsects of Christianity also have their own Bibles and their own interpretations. And you'll notice things missing or things added. It's because they're picking and choosing, which is never, if it's coming from God, how is that possible, right? So, not to say that every religion has, sacred texts where, it was politicized and weaponized and people manipulate it. That's every religion. That's not just Christianity. But, you know, oftentimes when people get worked up, their explanation is, well, it's God and God wouldn't let that happen. And just, you have to trust God and faith and blah and God. No, that doesn't make any sense because God gives you the tools to open your eyes and look at things and make educated, aware decisions, not to follow blindly because God. That's not that's not an answer. When people are picking and choosing and using different meanings assigned to different types of terms to push an agenda, it's our responsibility to be aware of that and not fall into that trap. That's part of, walking a spiritual path and being spiritually awakened. So, so there's some examples here. Different Bibles include certain things and blah, 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 blah. But let's jump into a little bit of this. Like I said, I didn't want to spend too much on this, but I definitely wanted to give you the highlights. So, books excluded from the Old Testament. So the Deuterocanonical, I can't pronounce that word, the Deuters. We're going to call it the Deuters. So these books are part of the Septuagint. Septuagint. That's the Greek Old Testament. Did you know that? That the Old Testament, there was a Greek version. It was used by the early church. But it was not included in the Hebrew Old Testament. Again, a lot of people aren't aware all these different versions were floating around out there. So the books of Tobit, Judith, the first and second Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, those were all excluded. And those reasons stemmed from, maybe somebody didn't like it wasn't from the Hebrew canon. There was arguments between Catholic and Orthodox that the inclusion was necessary to fully understand the history and theology of the Old Testament, but there was a lot of people that were anti-understanding. So it's unfortunate, but the Book of Enoch, that's a big one. Book of Jubilees. Those books were very popular in ancient times, but again, they were excluded from all major biblical canons. And, the reason for that, a lot of, of the higher ups, said they were inconsistent with other biblical traditions, meaning, they were saying things they didn't like, you don't have to go to church and give money to be close to God. They don't like things like that. Um, there was a lot of apocalyptic tone in some of those books too. But again, the apocalyptic tone was about self-salvation and how we all, transgress and move on to another plane of existence. And again, that defeated the whole you're going to heaven or hell and that's it theory, right? So important to know this stuff, right? So books excluded from the New Testament, all the Gnostic Gospels, those were all considered heretical. Okay. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, the the Apocryphon of John. I don't know if I'm saying that right. The Apo of John. So their teachings conflicted with Orthodox Christian beliefs at the time that, regarding the nature of God, Jesus, and salvation. These were books that talked about everybody's saved. Everybody has a soul and it will live on forever and move on to the next plane of existence. God is within, not without. Like, you don't have to go to church. You don't have to give money. You just have to be a good person and, learn. There's a lot of things they didn't like because they weren't going to make money on it and they couldn't control people. And you have to remember the original masters of the universe were these very old men in a room with lots of property and cattle, and they wanted to be in control and they wanted to have power. And so I know that's hard to swallow if you were raised Christian, but it is something to be aware of that in the beginnings, this is what, this is what created what we hold now as some sort of sacred text. That how sacred is it? Do I think it's sacred? Yes. But do I think it's been altered? Yes. By old men that wanted to hold on to property and wanted more. Acts of Paul, very popular story, but it was also excluded from the New Testament, um, for weird reasons, authorship and date of composition. I think a lot of these that you'll see were excluded for those reasons. It was BS. A lot of these books talk about things that would have allowed people to be more free, and not feel so scared or fear mongered to give and be in that church every Sunday and do all these things. These were books that set people free and talked about healing and divination and ghosts, and that the spirit world was okay and was part of our existence and blah blah blah. They don't like stuff like that. Okay. Saving ourselves, like we are in charge of our own salvation. Like it's not a God that's going to grant us salvation, it's us. We either curse or save ourselves, right? Things like that. All right, moving on. The Shepherd of Hermas, another very popular work in the early church, but was excluded for the same weird reasons. Didn't really make sense. I am not going to go through every single. So Leviticus is one of the most interesting books of the Bible, and that's because it is an extension of the Ten Commandments. And a lot of these laws and rules and regulations handed down by God resulted and were punishable by death. And when you look at these, it kind of boggles the mind because you can clearly see that these are human beings. God isn't giving a shit about half of this, right? This is human matters and human beings maybe wanting property or wanting taxes or, pushing their own personal agendas. And that's very evident in these Leviticus. I don't see where God would have handed down half of this, but example, the first two, burning any yeast or honey in offerings to God or failing to include salt in offerings to God was punishable by death. Does that make sense? Um, not testifying against a wrongdoing you've witnessed or failing to testify against any wrongdoing that you've been told. So again, this is control and power. They wanted people to come and tattle. And if you didn't come and tell them about something you heard, you could be executed. This was a control state, right? Touching unclean animals, carelessly making an oath, um, letting your hair become unkempt, tearing your clothes. My grandma always hated ripped jeans. Maybe that was why. Um, Eating an animal which doesn't both chew cud and has a divided hoof. I mean, some of these are just kind of wild. Here, let me move this over. I mean, some of these make sense. Having sex with family members, bad. Going to church within 33 days after giving birth to a boy or 66 days after giving birth to a girl. Um, I mean, some of these, a lot of eating or touching carcasses of different types of animals with different numbers of legs or that crawls on its belly or is an owl. I mean, just weird stuff, right? So maybe there was an animal rights activist on that panel, but these do not sound like any sort of ruling God's rules, but um, some of these again make sense. Having sex with a woman during her period could be punishable by death because she was so unclean, right? Marrying your wife's sister while your wife still lives, having sex with any animal that makes sense. Reaping to the very edges of a field. That sounds like a property owner wanting a reason to kill his neighbor and take his property. Same thing with picking up grapes that have fallen in your vineyard. Um, Defrauding your neighbor, holding back the wages of an employee overnight. That was punishable by death, right? Let's see what else we got here. Mixing fabrics and clothing, crossbreeding animals, um, eating fruit from a tree within 4 years of planting it, um, Obviously, practicing divination or seeking omens, especially astrology, that was punishable by death. Trimming your beard, getting tattoos, and my grandma used to say that tattoos, ear piercings, any kind of body mutilation, straight to hell. Getting your hair cut at the sides, um, turning to mediums or spiritualists, not standing in the presence of the elderly. You're expected to stand. Mistreating foreigners. Only the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. They have a very different view on other foreigners, which we'll get to. Again, I'm just kind of jumping around here. I mean, some of this is kind of weird. Um, Cursing your father or mother was punishable by death. Marrying a prostitute, a divorcee, or a widow, if you were a priest, was punishable by death. If you were a priest, you were not allowed to enter a place where there was a dead body, or it was punishable by death. Working on Sunday, punishable by death. So eye for an eye was a big thing in the Old Testament. So inflicting an injury, killing someone else's animal, or killing a person had to be punished in kind. So say you killed your neighbor's cow, he could come over and murder your cow. Say you killed your neighbor's son, he could come over and murder your son. Eye for an eye was a real thing back then. Selling land permanently. I've done some research on this. I'm not really, there's a lot of conflicted data out there. I'm not really sure what they meant by that, but I thought it was odd. Selling an Israelite as a slave was punishable by death, but foreigners are fine. They were fine for slaves. So again, I just kind of break down, some of this weird stuff we see in Leviticus, Exodus. Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Right. So, somebody who doesn't like shellfish, you're not allowed to eat shellfish. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here that sounds man-made. Um, I mean, some of it makes sense, don't get me wrong, but I just can't see God caring if you mixed fabrics. If you had to mix two different fabrics to make a shirt, I don't think he would want you dead. It makes no sense. When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean. That's in Leviticus. Okay, that's in the Bible. All editions for the most part. There's a few, maybe it's missing it, but now I do see so Deuteronomy has a lot of what I felt like were transgender or homosexual, phobic laws and rules. One of them that you're seeing make a resurgence that a lot of priests and preachers are using is this one. And Deuteronomy, I can't say that word. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So rules and regulations handed down by God and his chosen people that were his mouthpiece or written word piece. They're taking these and kind of using these today for anti-transgender transitioning things. I've been seeing a lot of that. So one of the rules in Leviticus, this is the King James version, is about blemishes. Anyone who has a blemish, like this person must have not liked unattractive people, only wanted attractive people in the church. I don't know, but whosoever hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach. A blind man, or a lame, or he that hath a flat nose, or anything superfluous, or a man that is broken footed, or broken handed, or crookback, or a dwarf, or that hath a blemish in his eye, or be scurvy, or scab, or hath his stones broken. He shall not go in unto the veil, nor come nigh unto the altar, because he hath a blemish, that he profane not my sanctuaries. Just one Sunday, I would love to see a priest get up there or a preacher and bring up this, Leviticus chapter and try to preach about it and make it make sense. Only attractive people are allowed. The rest of you are burning in hell. I'm sorry. It's just God said so. Um, Lots of slavery ones, people don't like talking about that either. Also in Leviticus, slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. That's Ephesians. Leviticus, you may purchase male or female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you. You may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat your slaves like this, but the people of Israel, your relatives, must never be treated this way. So again, so many contradictions to what God stands for and symbolizes. I believe these were, man-made injections into sacred text to push agendas, which is sad. We should talk more about this. I think, there is an awareness of this in, the Catholic and Christian communities, but we, just kind of don't talk about it. We just pretend it doesn't exist. But, you have to acknowledge this kind of stuff because if that's bullshit, there's other things that are bullshit too, right? Um, yeah, if you have a kid that's not listening to you, they're rebelling, they're stubborn, you're supposed to take them to the end of your driveway, call the city elders over, and they are supposed to stone them to death in front of you. That's in Deuteronomy. Again, mixing fabrics and clothing, punishable by death. Crossbreeding animals, punishable by death. Um, I'm just saying, like, think about it, you guys. It's just food for thought for you today. I'm not pushing an agenda. I just want to give you tools for your toolbox. So Jesus did fully support everything in the Old Testament. Here we have excerpts from Matthew and Luke and John where Jesus is specifically, speaking on the topic of these Old Testament teachings, um, where, he basically is saying nobody's getting into the kingdom of heaven unless you follow all of these rules. Here are the rules, follow them to the letter. Do not even think about, abolishing the laws or, not fulfilling them, or you're done for. I put the scripture here and where you can find them in the Bible. But yeah, Jesus was like, yep, that's the way it is. Do what we're saying. Here's a nice little chart. This is the first set of books banned from the Bible. The reasons they used for the banning, these were some of them, very generic, composed in Greek. Well, the original Bible was in Greek too, Greek and Hebrew. So, I mean, not originally written in Hebrew. I mean, these are kind of weird reasons to ban a sacred text from the Bible, but okay. That's the reasons they gave. But many of you are familiar with the Codex. It's one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible. It dates back to the 4th century CE. It contains a significant portion of both the Old and the New Testaments. So when exploring the Old Testament, books that basically the Protestants following the Jewish canon decided to remove from their version of the Bible. We'll kind of jump into that in this first chart here. And then we're going to kind of shift to the early Christian writings that were considered part of the Christian canon for a long time and then eventually excluded because, again, agendas change over time. So some of those writings, like the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, those once really held a revered place among, early Christian communities, but were later discarded, like, for really weird reasons. Again, because agendas change, leaders change, leadership changes, motivations change. You have to remember we live in a human ran society. So it's up to us as individuals to come to the truth, to come to our, truth. So the term canonical, listen, I don't know why I can't say that word. It's basically the Old Testament. This refers to the Jewish documents that originated between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. And those were incorporated into the Greek, but not the Hebrew Bible. So within the Protestant traditions and following that precedent set by the Jewish canon, that was mainly fixed by the end of that 2nd century CE, certain books were excluded, right? And again, agendas also changed at that time. It went from polytheistic to monotheistic, recognition of lots of gods, some of them being the same, to nope, only one God. So, so these writings, many of which were composed in Greek during a later period than the rest of the Hebrew Bible, were excluded due to concerns about, language, authorship, the era which they were composed. This is all kind of baloney stuff. It's just, they had to have a reason to write down on a piece of paper, I guess. Um, Now you'll see on the right side here, you guys have this video. You can go through and watch these at a later time or read through these at a later time. They're just stories connected to some of the books that I'm breaking down or just a little bit more information, but it's a lot of information and I don't want to be on here for 2 hours. So um, first there's Judith. The book of Judith tells a story of a Jewish widow who saves her people by assassinating a general. So basically, that book combined elements of not only history, but they claimed fiction to emphasize themes of faith, courage, and divine intervention. Well, it wasn't fiction. I'll tell you what the problem was, though. It was a woman. It was a woman who overtook a man and led a group of people, and it was female feminine power, goddess power. Didn't like that. They did not like that. Tobit. Tobit is a religious novel that follows the righteous Israelite Tobit and his son Tobias. The story explores themes of piety, charity, and divine justice. Again, Old Testament justice, and includes the intervention of Archangel Raphael, who aids Tobias in healing his father's blindness and defeating a quote unquote demon. I think part of the reason Tobit also was excluded is because there were a lot of themes of self-salvation in there and some polytheistic kind of Abrahamic stuff that didn't quite fit the there's only one God type agenda or there's only heaven and hell. I think there were other options Tobit rolled out. So that's part of the reason. So the first and second Maccabees, that's a historical account of the Jewish revolt, which was against the Seleucid Empire led by the Maccabee family. So focused on Judas, the book covers a struggle for Jewish independence, the rededication of the Jerusalem temple, which is, commemorated in Hanukkah. The second one was more theological and focused on God's role in the Jewish revolt. It really emphasized like martyrdom, divine justice, resurrection, and retells some events from a more religious perspective. And again, there was a polytheistic, there's more than this crazy heaven hell thing in there. So Wisdom of Solomon, that's a philosophical and theological text that really praises wisdom as a divine gift. It addresses themes like immortality of the soul and divine retribution, blending Jewish beliefs with Hellenistic philosophy. So you know why that was banned. Then there's Sirach, also known as, and I always had a hard time saying this word when I was a kid, Ecclesiasticus. I can't. Ecclesiasticus. Blah, blah, blah. We'll just call it Eccle. So that's a collection of proverbs and ethical teachings written by Ben Sira around 180 BCE. It focuses on wisdom, proper conduct, and the importance of honoring God with practical advice for daily life. Well, the church didn't like that because they wanted 10%. They wanted everybody in there every Sunday. Also, the proverbs are spells, and I'll get into that a little bit later on, but they are spells. Then there was Baruch, presented as a work by the secretary of the prophet Jeremiah. It includes prayers, reflections on the Babylonian exile, and an exhortation for the people of Israel to turn back to God. A lot of the Babylonian stuff, the Babylonian pantheons, Syrian gods, prayers that were actually spells. This is part of the reason why this book was banned. Additions to the book of Esther. So there was 6 extra chapters that expand the narrative with more religious elements, including prayers, spells, and the visible hand of God. Visible, not invisible, visible hand of God, which are largely absent from the original Hebrew version. But this was definitely banned because it talked about God taking on flesh and coming down and doing things. So yeah, can't have that. Can't have that. Let's see. Additions to the book of Daniel. So those were stories such as Susanna, Belle, and the Dragon, and the Song of the Three Jews. And so those contain further examples of Daniel's wisdom and his deliverance by God, thus reinforcing the themes of faith and divine intervention. Again, there's a lot of talk of afterlife stuff in there, a lot of that Egyptian methodology. And again, anything that was polytheistic or talked about there being alternatives to the heaven and hell they have, you know, designed or anything that made people feel or think they didn't have to go to church every Sunday or give their 10%. I mean, anything that was outside of what they wanted people doing, was banned. Okay, so as the exploration of the books removed from the Bible goes further, there is another category of excluded writings. The early Christian books that were once considered canonical, am I saying that word right? Canonical by some communities, but were ultimately left out of the New Testament. Oh, I think I might be losing my voice. I've been talking a lot today. All right, early Christian writings. Um, Books once considered canonical. All right, so one thing I want to point out, and I want you to really listen to the statement. The New Testament, as we know it, which is everybody's using that, right? It didn't drop out of heaven fully formed, you guys. Okay, rather, it was the result of a centuries long process of old white men in rooms that own a lot of property, shaping it by a variety of social, theological, and historical circumstances and agendas and politics. Please keep that in mind. So, the formation of the New Testament wasn't only lengthy, but also complex, with some books being considered canonical by different Christian communities before eventually still being removed. So let's talk about Bishop Eusebius, 4th century CE. He was in charge of categorizing these early Christian writings. So the first category that this bishop mentions are books which he called acknowledged. So those included the 4 Gospels, Acts, and Paul's epistles, right? Including Hebrews. So that was 1 Peter, 1 John, and the book of Revelation. Hang on. Again, old white guy with property. And here's a little chart here for this section that I'm going through now. The book, the reason for the exclusion, some of them are ridiculous, like Clement, concerns about the authorship. That makes no sense. But anyway, a sacred text is a sacred text. If you found it with the, the book of Job, what do you mean? Authorship issues. Anyway, let's take a brief look at the summaries of the early Christian writings that were once considered to be canonical by different communities in the Roman Empire. I don't know if I'm saying that word right. Canonical, canons, canonical. The Epistle of Barnabas. So this is an early Christian text that presents a theological interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, emphasizing the rejection of Jewish rituals and the belief that Christianity represents the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. So that was likely written in the first or the late first or early second century. And then we have the Shepherd of Hermas. That's an early Christian allegory presented as a series of visions and moral teachings, centering on themes of repentance and spiritual growth. So now it was written in the second century. And it was highly regarded in many Christian communities. So Origen called it divinely inspired even. But it was ultimately excluded from the New Testament due to Montanism. So that was an early Christian movement that really emphasized the imminent return of Jesus, strict moral codes, ecstatic visions, and direct inspiration from the Holy Spirit. It was a cult. And that cult had gained some steam for a short period of time, and they actually changed texts to not piss this cult off. Anyway, moving on. Acts of Paul. Early Christian text that narrates the missionary journeys and martyrdom of the Apostle Paul, emphasizing themes of chastity and virtue. So that was written in the late second century. It was excluded from the New Testament due to doubts about its apostolic authorship, and some of its more legendary elements. Well, it was found with other sacred texts, so I don't know how you're going to accept one text and not the other because they were together. I don't know. Gospel of Peter. Even though Eusebius doesn't include it within his second category, we do know that some Christian communities use the Gospel of Peter as scripture. Eusebius mentions Bishop Serapion, who at the end of the second century wrote a pamphlet trying to persuade a community in Rhodes to exclude the Gospel of Peter from their canon. Again, we're going back to politics. So that fascinating writing, which was not discovered until the 19th century, kind of offered a distinctive account of Jesus's trial, his crucifixion, and his resurrection, one that was removed from the Bible. Why would that be removed? Most scholars argue that traces of Docetism in the text were the primary reason. So we have this Gospel of Peter that really gives a lot of details about Jesus's supposed trial, crucifixion, or resurrection, but it's been banned. It's been locked up in a vault. All right, the Apocalypse of Peter, another early Christian apocalyptic text, vivid descriptions of heaven and hell, the different layers of heaven and hell, pandemonium. If you're familiar with Goetic, you're familiar with pandemonium. Detailing the rewards for the righteous and the punishments for sinners. It was excluded due to its doubts about its apostolic origin and debated theological themes. So this one individual, he's a big guy in the Christian community. He proposed that this Apocalypse of Peter originally included a very controversial idea of the eventual guaranteed salvation of all sinners, a concept that was preserved in the later Sibylline oracles. However, this idea, did not serve the church well or their agenda. How are they going to grow? How are they going to stay in power if we're all just going to be forgiven anyway, right? So at some point it was removed, and it was completely suppressed from the Christian canon, completely. Then there's, I don't know how to pronounce this, the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. That was an early Christian manual of ethics or rituals and church practices. And I'll tell you, Roman Catholicism, especially Trinity, is very ritualized, very pagan in its origins, even now. So it does provide valuable insight into early Christian communities, but it was excluded from the New Testament because it wasn't considered to be, again, of apostolic origin. Also, he shares a lot of material from the Gospel of Matthew. So I think it could be possible that some of it was redundant, or seen as redundant, but still, I think they should have included it because it was a sacred text found with other sacred texts. They're picking and choosing. Then there's Clement. That is actually a letter written by the Clement of Rome in circa 95 CE to the church in Corinth, addressing issues of church leadership and unity. So that letter emphasized the importance of harmony and discipline within the Christian community, urging the Corinthians to resolve internal disputes peacefully. So this was a highly esteemed document in early Christianity, but it wasn't included in the New Testament because it wasn't authored by an apostle or a close companion of one, which I think is bullshit. I think that letter, it talks about the disharmony and the headbutting and the private agendas. And, the church doesn't want people aware of that kind of stuff going on. Okay, so then we have the Gospel according to Hebrews. That was it's a lost early Christian text known only through fragments. That's all that remains, and references in other writings of early church fathers. So Judeo-Christian communities were probably using that gospel, which contains stories about Jesus plus his alleged sayings originally. When the Hebrew Bible first came out along with that Greek Bible. So obviously, it's a very complex and layered process of forming the biblical canon, and that's always changing. Biblical canon. Say that 3 times fast. So, it is a dynamic and evolving process driven by theological debates, questions of authenticity, and the shifting needs of early Jewish and Christian communities. You have to understand, these are people, these are editors, and they are editing sacred texts. That's why God says it's our responsibility to come to the truth on our own terms. We have the tools, we have to use them. If we're just going to go in blindly and be led blindly, then that's on us. So excluded texts, however, continue to offer valuable insights into the religious and cultural context of their time. So while they may not have made the final cut into the canon, their existence highlights the diversity of beliefs and practices that are characterized in early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. So it's important to acknowledge that, which churches nowadays don't do. Acknowledgement is not their strong point. Okay, so before ending part 1, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Psalms. Psalms are spells used in primitive Baptist environments still to this day, you guys. It is a form of folk magic. You know, churches, especially Southern Baptist churches, are called prayers or praise houses. And those praise houses, after, service, there was healing energy workers and workings done there in the basement and outside. Like I said, my grandma used to load poppets right there out the back door. Very synchronistic work. Voodoo priests use psalms and scriptures. And again, we see that polytheism because the psalms are polytheistic. They are a blending of saints, associations. There is referencing to the seven Loa, the Haitian and African gods. It's all kind of hodgepodge, like what we were talking about in the beginning. So you see psalms and proverbs used by Southern Conjure practitioners, Appalachian magic, Pennsylvania Dutch powwow magic, hoodoo, Southeast folk magic, all over the place. The Psalms predate Christianity by an estimated 1,800 years. I want you to think about that for a minute. The very first psalm was written by Moses, supposedly, allegedly. We have psalms that have been collected over millennia here from ancient Greek temples that were in possession of temples of Dimitri, Mercury, Persephone, all sorts of Roman gods, Babylonians, Egyptian gods, Israelites. They're everywhere, and they were all being used as spells in all these places. So in ancient Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, Syrian times, things did get mushed together, like I was talking about in the very beginning. Polytheism came in, this omnistic approach. And so a lot of the Psalms represent that. So, for example, the 109th Psalm was a psalm used to curse Pompeii. It was written in Hebrew in a Roman city. And what happened to Pompeii, folks? You know what happened. There is a psalm, it's the 1578th Psalm, number 3 of that quatrain, that was used against the Spanish Armada. And what happened to the Spanish Armada, folks? So, these are, there's lots of stories like that. We're going to get into that a little bit more next month. I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of a primer. But Psalms, so at one point there were thousands and thousands of Psalms, and there still is thousands and thousands of Psalms. But again, the biblical canon, the Christian powers of the universe, narrowed it down to only 150. So only 150 of the original 10,000 Psalms are published in any sort of Bible. So it is considered, Psalms are considered words from our ancestors, which they are. They are incantations. They're also, statements of gratitude, or asking for help. They have been written in Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Romantic English and Guttural English. So they span every single piece of time. You will find that translations were wrong with some of the Psalms, especially the ones that are in print in Bibles now. The term God was not the proper translation. That was manipulated by the powers that be. There is a connection here to Buddhism, to Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. And Buddhism, and those practices, they use mantras and malas, right? Mantras are sacred words, sacred sounds, sacred syllables. They're oral spells. And the Psalms are just that. Proverbs too. These words have power. It's oral magic. It's magic breathing. Same thing in Buddhism. So, it's that omnistic correlation. Same practice there with mantras. So also it's important to remember in early Christian days, early Christian mysticism was a thing, okay? There was the laying of hands. There was the use of herbs and candles and repetition. You see that in movies too sometimes, like repeat the Virgin Mary, whatever, 3, 5, 7, or 9 times. There's numerology there, right? So there is magic in Christianity, you guys. You just need to know how to interpret it and to digest it and where to find it in some of these banned sacred texts. When we talk about the New Testament too, which is what's widely used now, we have to talk about King Solomon and King David. King Solomon, who wrote 3 of the Psalms that are published now, he was the founder of the Western occult. He is the founder of the seals, the lesser keys, the demonic control rings. He It was an occultist obsessed with demons. Okay, obsessed with them. And a lot of the old grimoires used in, demonolatry or in, goetic works, King Solomon is very prevalent, although he enslaved demons. I don't believe in enslavement of any spirit, transient or deital, minor deital, but you had an occultist writing, editing the Bible. Think about that for a minute. Then you had King David. King David was a closeted gay. That has been written about over, I mean, that man lived probably in angst. He also had paranoid delusions. He believed witches were out for him. And he did weird shit because of it. He was of the Jewish faith. He is the one that kind of created the term as above, so below, and we use that in magic now. He wrote 73 of the Psalms that are in use right now that have been approved and published by, the Christian churches. So again, I'm just giving you insight into who these people were as people, because they're the ones editing and putting hands on the New Testament, not God. They're taking what God got to us and then they're doing what they want to do with it, right? So the King James Version Bible, it is not authentic. It is not the most accurate. The scripture there was edited. Do your research. Do your research. Don't take my word for it. There are many different versions of the Bible. The Bibles and all the ones that are in use now have had many, many changes over the years. There are a lot of forbidden gospels that have been, kind of buried and locked away that I really encourage you to research. One of them is the Gospel of Sophia, the wisdom of God. I believe this is the Holy Ghost. And that gospel, from the perspective of the Holy Ghost and the wisdom of God, I think is so profound. But again, locked away. People can't have access to that information. It also takes out the need for you to go to church every Sunday and give 10%, so they're not going to allow that stuff through. So next month, we are going to review the Psalms, the spells in detail. We're going to dive a little bit more into King Solomon. We're going to dive a little bit more into the Ars Goetia, those Abrahamic pantheons that Yahweh, Tetragrammaton, the God comes from. We're going to also discuss very briefly the 183 books that have been secret, lost, forbidden, or stolen that are sacred biblical texts. And I will tell you my gift to you guys this holiday season is every day in the month of December, I will be uploading 6 of those 183 books to my Patreon for free download. And so that will begin December 1st. And that is my gift. And some of these are very difficult to find. Okay. I had to get them from virtual libraries, from Harvard, and all over the place. So about 6 a day for the whole month of December, every day. That's my holiday gift to everybody. It is the full text, the full scans of these sacred texts. So it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, an atheist, a conspiracy theorist, or simply just curious, like a curious historian that wants to kind of unravel these dark secrets and mysteries behind, what is really the most read and powerful book on earth. This is a huge collection of rare and hard to find literature that is an absolute must in terms of research. So I will start that December 1st, and then part 2 will come out at some point in December. I don't have a date yet, but it won't be too far in because I'd like to get it done before Yule, Saturnalia, Christmas. But I just want to thank you guys again for your continued Patreon support. By you guys subscribing to that $5 a month and higher tiers, it really helps me be able to continue to do these EDUs and to provide everything I'm providing. I really enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it. If you haven't already, visit us on our Etsy. We're our main website. We've been revamping, trying to get that more interactive. And of course, our YouTube. I'm always putting EDU videos on there. So check that out. But other than that, let me stop sharing. Again, I'm not, I just want to give you guys tools. I'm always talking about different branches of spiritual practice. And because we are in the holiday season, I thought, why not talk about the Bible and Christianity a little bit? And I just wanted to give you some tools and resources and some food for thought, right? It's always good to look at things with a different set of eyes, to have perspective, right? To either solidify and validate your feelings or your thoughts, or to maybe spark something in you that creates the need and desire to go out and learn or research, right? To come to your own conclusions. But anyway, stay magical, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Adios.